Welcome back. I'm delighted to be joined by Gennady Stolyarov II. Just to say, first of all, thank you very much for your time. You are obviously the chair of the Transhumanist Party US. Now, it's an exciting time for you. You've got a presidential election coming up and you've got a candidate, Charlie Kam. And what's the kind of the rationale for standing a transhumanist candidate? Is it kind of mainly to try and raise awareness? Is it to try and take votes from the main parties so they can adopt your ideas? What's the argument for it?
So in the United States, it is quite difficult for a minor political party to gain a significant number of votes. However, it is still possible to affect the political landscape. First of all, if one is running for a political office, one can garner the attention of people who might not, for instance, pay attention to academic conferences or literary works or research papers. So this is another channel to reach out to the general public. And what I have found out with regard to my experience with transhumanism is that the barrier really isn't hostility on the part of the general public. The greatest barrier is unawareness. So how does one spread awareness? One seeks to reach new demographics, and one seeks to reach them using creative means. So from my standpoint, the presidential nominee of the US Transhumanist Party is primarily a spokesperson for the ideas of transhumanism, of radical life extension, of emerging technologies that are poised to transform the human condition in the next several decades.
Yeah. But I was speaking to Zoltan Istvan, who was your candidate last time round about this, and the comparison he brought up several times was with the environmental movement. So in the way that kind of the Green Party started off very much as a fringe movement, but it didn't just grow itself, it brought its ideas into the mainstream. And he was saying that that's how he thinks transhumanists should operate, because I know there's some dispute within the movement as to whether you should have your own independent party or not. I'm assuming that's very much your thing, is other kind of a Green Party style insurgency.
Yes, so right now, as Zoltan Istvan correctly points out, there are many mainstream politicians who would identify themselves as environmentalists, even though they belong to a major political party. So hopefully, within a decade or two, we will have mainstream politicians identifying themselves as transhumanists. And they'll say, of course, I'm a transhumanist. I happen to be a Republican transhumanist or a Democratic transhumanist or a Tory transhumanist or a Labor transhumanist. That would be the kind of world that we seek to reach. And the role of a minor political party is to place emphasis on the issues. And if we do get votes in the presidential election, what that will do is it will serve as a signaling mechanism to other politicians to pay attention to these constituents who want to accelerate the development of emerging technologies for a better future. Because if these politicians pay attention to these constituents, incorporate aspects of our platform into their platforms, they might get more votes. That is our desired outcome.
One very interesting analogy that I was kind of wondering about is with Andrew Yang. So obviously, universal basic income is an idea which has been around for a very long time in kind of academic circles and economic circles. But it was never really part of the mainstream conversation until Andrew Yang came along. He kind of dragged it into the mainstream, and now, everyone's talking about it. I mean, do you think the same is going to happen with transhumanism at some point? At the moment, it's still kind of a niche academic scientific movement. But at some point, either someone or something is going to come and drag it right into the mainstream. And then you'll have Republicans and Democrats, as you say, talking about it as though it's any other political issue.
Yes, and I think this is going to arise through a combination of advocacy as well as technological developments and societal developments that aid in this recognition. So Andrew Yang right now could be seen as prophetic with regard to proposing universal basic income as a remedy to longer-term economic shifts. And then just a month after he suspended his campaign, the world was hit with the COVID-19 pandemic. And all of a sudden, these shifts that were expected to take place over a longer period of time essentially materialized overnight. And the countries that implemented some sort of unconditional support for their populace ended up having a much smoother experience coping with the pandemic. So likewise, there are going to be advances in biotechnology, in personalized medicine, in various treatments that could repair the damage caused to the body by various diseases and biological aging. A lot of gene therapies are already in clinical trials, or some gene therapies have been approved for rare diseases. One could make the case that we already have some people who were able to at least somewhat reverse their biological aging. Elizabeth Parrish, the first recipient of a combination gene therapy in 2015, is most likely someone who did that. I have encountered her at various conferences for the past 4 years, and she seems younger now than she did in 2016. So these developments are already underway. At some point in this decade, they're going to reach a critical mass, and that is going to lead people to think about how these developments are going to affect their lives. Will they be able to have access to these kinds of breakthrough treatments? And of course, how will these advances affect society? How will pension systems need to be rethought? How would governments need to respond in terms of making some sort of provision for these treatments to become available? Because right now, a lot of government funded healthcare goes to care for people in old age, and much of it is palliative, or much of it is a losing battle against the advancement of disease. Wouldn't it be excellent, not just from a humanitarian standpoint, but from a fiscal standpoint, if people could be kept biologically young for much longer, so that these extreme costs at the end of life do not have to be borne, at least to the same extent? So as the critical mass of advances builds up, and at the same time as our advocacy spreads, people are going to realize these are important issues to consider. And politicians are generally lagging indicators rather than leading indicators of societal change. So the politicians will pick up on this once they see that there's significant public interest. And the Transhumanist Party in the United States, as well as transhumanist parties in other nations around the world, the UK has its own Transhumanist Party, for example, serve the purpose of being at the forefront of bringing this awareness to politicians, so that it doesn't hit them all at once. It dawns on them gradually. And it seems to me the biggest challenge sometimes in reaching people is just exposing them to the ideas enough. The first time they hear the idea, they might just dismiss it or think it's too outlandish. But if they hear it more and more from different people, from different sources, they're going to start essentially investing more credence in these types of possibilities.
Yeah. I mean, so certainly in my view, I don't know about in your view, but I mean, issues like human augmentation and how we kind of interact our society with vastly more powerful artificial intelligence, it seems to me that in, 2 decades, 3 decades, those will be some of the critical questions in global politics. I mean, utterly defining questions, really. And obviously, at the moment, very few people are talking about it, which is why I'm very interested in the transhumanist movement. I mean, does the movement have a very kind of a vanguard feel to it? It kind of feels that it's talking about issues that are going to become mainstream, 20 to 30 years' time.
Yes, indeed. And I think this is a movement filled with individuals who are capable of this kind of longer range foresight, and who are capable of essentially keeping an eye on the truly transformational trends that are going to affect the human condition and affect all of our lives going forward. I think sometimes in day-to-day mainstream political discourse, there's this myopia, and it's driven by the 24-hour news cycle. It's driven by the short attention spans of many people, but they focus on the controversies of the day, whatever protest happened in a large city, or what the statistics for the pandemic are turning out to be on this particular day in this particular part of the world. And a lot is happening in the near term, but sometimes it leads people to miss the kinds of transformations that can happen over the long term. The fact is, our lives right now are quite unrecognizable from the standpoint of circa 2010. It would have been difficult 10 years ago to envision that we would be in this particular reality. And yet these changes have happened. So I think it's important to bring awareness to these future possibilities to get people out of the status quo bias. Now, the status quo bias has existed for a long time because historically, if you were, say, a medieval peasant, it's likely that your father was a medieval peasant and your grandfather was a medieval peasant. And sure, you had wars and plagues and famines and other hardships to deal with, but the tools you were working with, the types of activities you could be expected to engage in would be pretty much constant for your entire life. So that was the human condition for the vast majority of our history. And only since the Industrial Revolution has this kind of transformational progress in one's own lifetime been a reality. But culture, of course, evolves more slowly than technology. So some people still think the way the world is right now is the way it has always been and the way it will always be. And it takes advocacy and it takes education to move them away from that status quo bias.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's something that concerns you, but sometimes it seems to me that some of the leaders that are taking this stuff most seriously, so about, you know, the impact of artificial intelligence and human augmentation, are the more authoritarian leaders. So, for example, Xi Jinping is known to be very interested in gene editing, very interested in AI. Putin has talked a lot about AI. I mean, I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something along the lines of "He who masters AI will rule the world." It was something along those lines. Whereas sort of Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or Trudeau or Macron don't really seem to say very much about it at all. I was wondering if it's something that worries you. Why does it seem that the Democratic leaders in particular are kind of dropping the ball on this event?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is in part an artifact of how contemporary politics in the more democratic countries has shaped up to be. So we've had in many countries this first past the post electoral system, which tends to lead to political polarization and ultimately societal polarization. It's a kind of downward spiral where the society turns in on itself, and there come to be these two opposing camps that care more about clashing with one another and wresting power from one another than they care about future advancements. Now, in prior eras in the Western world, that clash used to be more contained. There used to be more norms of civility or areas of shared consensus. But now it seems that clash has encompassed almost all areas of life. And in authoritarian regimes, for all of their faults, that doesn't exist. And the leaders have the luxury of a longer time horizon. Now, often they have to do terrible things to stay in power, but they could be thinking about what will the world be like in 20 years, because they could remain in power 20 years from now. So the challenge for Western liberal democratic societies is, how do we cultivate that long-term awareness and that long-term investment without lapsing into authoritarianism? We need areas of leadership in our society which aren't subject to this constant struggle for power. And historically in the Western world, free enterprise has been a bastion of that kind of leadership. Think of what Elon Musk is doing in the United States with Tesla and SpaceX and Solar City and tunnels and hyperloops. That is only possible because Elon Musk has an accumulation of capital that he can dedicate to his chosen purposes, and he has this vision for transforming certain aspects of technology. So the challenge politically is, how do we reform the system enough to create these avenues for innovation that are guided by visionary individuals? And those could be entrepreneurs, they could be scientists, they could be policymakers. You could have an innovative city planner, for instance, who designs futuristic infrastructure within a city. So it's not necessarily a matter of public versus private, it's a matter of having open playing fields for innovation and experimentation that can't be vetoed by some competing force in the society.
Yeah. And presumably, if you think, as I think we both do, that there are going to be kind of massive revolutionary technological changes in the next 40 years or so, it matters hugely for the future of human civilization whether those changes happen in a kind of a liberal democratic context or in an autocratic or authoritarian context, which most likely in practice means in the United States of America or in China. I mean, is that something you'd agree with? the transhumanist party in countries like America and the West more generally isn't just about, you know, living longer and advancing yourself. It's also about fundamentally protecting liberal democracy, because if we don't master these technologies, other people will.
Oh, absolutely. So the US Transhumanist Party has an extensive platform, and a large portion of that platform, which can be found on our website, transhumanist-party.org, is devoted to protecting individual liberty, privacy, freedom from government intervention into the choices that individuals make to lead their lives. So, for instance, we frequently discuss in our platform, how do we make sure that police do not abuse the rights of the citizens? How do we make sure that people are protected against unreasonable surveillance? How do we make sure that people have morphological freedom, the ability as individuals to make choices about their biology, about their morphology, to choose to use or not to use certain technologies? So we certainly wouldn't want a centralized mandate for the use of a given technology, even if on net that technology would be beneficial. We want individuals to decide for themselves what would work for them. And we also have the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, which was voted by our members in several iterations. It is on its third version right now, which seeks to generalize the concept of rights, not only to apply universally to humans, but to other sentient entities that could emerge in the future, for instance, as a result of an artificial general intelligence being developed, or as a result of certain biological modifications made to humans and even non-humans in the coming decades. So when we have these discussions about rights now, instead of several decades from now, we can hopefully anticipate some of these questions and essentially head off any potential resistance to empowering these individuals and recognizing their rights within future societies. So this is quite crucial. And I think it's crucial to bring these issues to the forefront of politicians in liberal democracies, specifically so that they could begin focusing on them, and everyone's model of a technological future isn't a regimented authoritarian one, but rather one of individual choice and diversity and tolerance.
Yeah. Now, obviously, this almost certainly isn't going to happen, certainly in the short term. But just for the sake of argument, imagine that Charlie wins in 2020. I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure how many ballots on that kind of thing. But just for the sake of argument, and what would kind of be the policy priorities? What would be the things the Transhumanist Party US would most likely change about American government?
Well, one of the major policy priorities would be to streamline and expedite the review and approval process for new medicines, devices, and other treatments for conditions, especially related to aging. So right now, it's difficult to develop effective treatments for aging and market them because the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, does not consider aging a disease. So an executive order declaring aging a disease would be a day one action, and then an action that would follow shortly thereafter would be deregulating the approval process so that there would be some basic safety. We wouldn't want adulterated medicines, for instance. We wouldn't want medicines that have such adverse side effects that people would be more at risk of taking them than not taking them. But this very burdensome chain of efficacy tests that the FDA currently requires and that lead to many medicines taking 10 to 15 years and billions of dollars to be approved, those tests can be conducted in a very different fashion. The companies or other developers could be allowed to market their drugs first and then gather data from the actual patient population. And the understanding of efficacy will emerge through essentially more rigorous data gathering and more relevant data than these highly contrived clinical trials today can provide. So that's one major area of reform. Another major area of reform would be greatly bolstering our infrastructure for fighting disease, and that would include resiliency against pandemics. So the US Transhumanist Party has proposed a massive hospital construction initiative, as well as creating stockpiles of essential supplies that would always be on hand to be distributed to the public as well as medical practitioners in the event of an emergency. But in creating all of this capacity, we also want to make sure that there's another purpose to this capacity, and that is medical research. So let's say we greatly expand the space available in our hospitals, and that space is empty much of the time. How else could it be used? It could be used as research facilities, and there could be sustained funding for research into not just combating specific diseases, but also reversing biological senescence and reaching what is called longevity escape velocity, where life expectancy improves by more than 1 year for every year that passes. That is really the key, by the way, for solving future pandemics, because as we all know, the overwhelming majority of the casualties due to COVID-19 are the elderly. And that's the case for many other infectious diseases as well. Had biological senescence not existed today, COVID-19 would be a blip on the radar screen of humanity. There would still be some infections, some adverse consequences, but it certainly would not dominate the headlines, and it would not lead to massive economic disruptions the way it has done. So solving the problem of biological aging really is the key toward a more resilient and disease-free world.
Well, this is a kind of slightly associated question, but I've been doing some reading on biohacking as well. So that's obviously people essentially trying to augment their bodies. I guess you could say in almost like a DIY way. I mean, do you think that every individual should have the freedom to do whatever they want to their own body?
Well, I believe individuals have this right of morphological freedom, which includes the right to self-experiment and implement body modifications. Hopefully they can do so in a safe way, and I would encourage people to do so in a prudent way. So don't just start biohacking without doing your research, without having the proper tools, without taking proper safety precautions. But ultimately, each individual has a risk-reward calculus that individual engages in, and provided that individuals are properly informed and efficacious in their actions, we are supportive of their rights to do that. Indeed, the US Transhumanist Party successfully advocated in 2019 in the state of Nevada to prevent a ban on voluntary microchip implants in individuals. There were some irrational fears that these chips could be used as surveillance devices, even though the NFC and RFID tags don't have the technical capability to do that. But we pointed out that these are tools for individual empowerment. They allow people to expand everyday functionality. They could interact with mobile phones. They could open doors. We had a cyborg magician in there who showed all of the magic tricks that could be done, to the astonishment of legislators with the implanted chips. And people realized this isn't some nefarious external imposition that could be used to track people. Mobile phones are much more effective at tracking people than these chips. Rather, these are choices that individuals make in the quest to broaden their possible range of experiences, and in some cases, to compensate for certain disabilities. So there was a lot more receptiveness to at least allowing this experimentation to happen. And I think this also goes back to the concept of individual responsibility, and having this information and these possibilities being available, being out there, creates the space for individual responsibility, because people could follow what others had done. And someone who is self-experimenting could produce data that others can then look at and have that data guide their actions. There are even websites now that are emerging that allow individuals to submit their own data to a platform where it's systematically reviewed and then made available for other users, so that perhaps they don't repeat the same mistakes or they follow some promising leads.
Okay. I've kind of come across two very interesting arguments from transhumanists as to why they want to modify themselves. So obviously the obvious one is they want to live longer and be more intelligent, be more capable, etc. But the second one, which I've come across more and more the more people I've spoken to, is that the human body, as produced by evolution, as produced by natural selection, has certain flaws which are the product of evolution. So, for example, we're deeply tribalistic as a species. We're quite inclined towards violence. And those are probably things that made complete sense back in the hunter-gatherer society we're involved into. There's probably evolutionary advantages to being tribalistic and inclined towards violence. In our modern society, and when paired with particularly modern weaponry, so obviously nuclear weapons in particular, and the kind of weapon we're going to have in the future becomes downright dangerous. I mean, do you think it's the case that we need to modify humans to kind of knock off some of those evolutionary rough edges? And if we fail to do so, we'll always be at risk, perhaps potentially even of an extinction event.
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. The human mind evolved in a very different environment. And Paleolithic tribal warfare was brutal, by the way. Steven Pinker, in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, points out that casualty rates in these tribal skirmishes were on the order of 50%. And when you consider that World War II wiped out about 3% of the world population, and that was the deadliest modern war, we can see that in a relative sense, living in a primitive tribal society is actually far riskier. But having these tribal impulses has been shown to be deleterious, not only in causing wars, but causing your everyday toxicity on social media. And getting people out of that mindset is crucial for reaching the age of abundance and peace and universal super longevity that we all desire, because these tribalistic mindsets could come in and derail the progress, unfortunately. So there needs to be a focus on human enhancement, not just of the body, but of the mind. And how to do that is a challenge, because the human brain is one of the most complex organs in existence. And to truly modify it, one has to understand it enough to at least know that the modification is beneficial and doesn't produce adverse side effects. So right now, I would say our best tool and our most promising tool for that kind of modification is rational discourse combined with online technologies of education, gamification, interactions that bring out the better part of our natures. But over time, say with Elon Musk's Neuralink initiative, with other integrations between artificial intelligence and the human brain, there could be greater possibilities for improvement. So think about an integration between the processing capabilities of a computer, the ability to perform billions of calculations per second, the ability to instantaneously download information and store it with essentially perfect recall, and the creative faculties of the human mind, the ability to essentially recombine information in novel and meaningful ways. All of that is going to lead to essentially a new renaissance in human creativity, in technological innovation, and I hope in peace and understanding. We do somehow need to transcend the bottleneck of our still primitive, evolved minds.
I mean, one, I'm sure you come across it, but I think it was in the 90s, Francis Fukuyama wrote quite a famous piece when he said that, I can't remember what the exact wording was, but it was along the lines of transhumanism is the world's most dangerous ideology, or the biggest threat to liberal democracy. And his argument seemed to be that it resulted in such a kind of disparate, such a difference in human intellect within our species and human ability, that we'd no longer be able to constrain ourselves to one person, one vote system. That, I think that seemed to me to be another of the argument. I mean, do you think there's anything to that? Do you think there's any way that liberal democracy and transhumanism could end up clashing as the kind of the difference in human intellect increases?
Well, I think the error that Fukuyama made was he presupposed that there was a single hierarchy along which human enhancement would take place. And if you weren't on a high place in that hierarchy, then you would be relegated to some sort of underclass. But the fact is, human enhancement is going to lead to a proliferation of different choices made by individuals. And that, by the way, is why individual freedom to modify or not modify oneself is so important. So some people might choose to use biotechnology in order to live longer. Other people might choose to, for instance, have an extremely durable skeleton or to be able to run faster. And how do you compare those on a single scale? It would be difficult, if not impossible, to do. So can you really say the person who can run faster is more enhanced than the people with exceptionally durable skeletons? So again, that speaks to the distinction between variety in morphology and capability, and then some more fundamental equality of worth that we have as human beings. And right now, in many societies, there are great differences among their inhabitants. So some people are much wealthier than others. Some people are much more educated than others. And yet we have a recognition that anyone who has reached the age of maturity as defined within that society is able to vote. And there's no reason why that would need to be suspended or limited in any way. Indeed, I would say there are systems that would enhance the ability of individuals to participate. For instance, ranked preference voting, various electronic voting systems, which with sufficient security and verifiability could greatly increase participation. So this is a situation where I think diversity is going to be our protection against the kind of future that Fukuyama envisions, because there's not going to be one solution for every person. Rather, people will be allowed to flourish in ways that they believe will enhance their lives.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this is your view as well, but it's kind of a random thought I had. But certainly when I talk to people about transhumanism, as in lay people, quite often they sort of get a bit iffy about it, because you start to about human modification, and they start thinking, well, I'm not really sure we like that. I mean, it seems to me that human modification isn't really optional. I mean, it's going to happen. It's the conditions under which it happens that really matters. So is it done responsibly in a way that benefits the whole species, or is it done in such a way that benefits a small elite? And correspondingly, is it perfected in liberal democracies, or is it perfected in authoritarian states? I kind of feel that there's almost no way to stop. The way our technology is progressing, there's no way to stop human modification without either like a near extinction event or some kind of dictatorship so oppressive that it would make Stalinism look liberal. I don't know if that's your view as well.
Yes, I think some experimentation is going to happen no matter what. It's a question of where it's going to happen and under what conditions. And certainly the more open and available these possibilities are, the better the outcomes are going to be. If anything is done on a black market, it's going to be associated with a variety of other ills that don't inherently relate to the activity in question, but they relate to the conditions in which it's able to take place. If you
Sorry, it very briefly froze, but I got what you said. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, I can hear you. Is there anything that you need me to repeat?
No, don't worry, that was great. We got to the end of the sentence and it just sort of very briefly froze. So in terms of, I know there's obviously all sorts of different technology transhumanists are interested in, from mind uploading to whole body prosthetics, all sorts of stuff. Is there any one thing that really excites you about what you think the future is going to be?
Well, for me, there's such an abundance of possible activities to pursue already that longevity is most definitely the most exciting possibility for me, because I see all of these ways that I could be spending my time, even with existing technologies, the books that I have in my possession, all of the possibilities for creation using digital tools, or the ability to find art or explore virtual worlds. No matter how long one lives, one isn't going to exhaust those possibilities. So the most scarce resource right now is time. And if that scarcity were lifted, it would be a wonderful life indeed to just be able to delve into this ocean of human creativity, as well as everything that is out there in the natural world.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of kind of the time scale, I mean, if someone's watching this, say they're in their mid-30s, for example, I mean, could they plausibly expect that during their lifetime? Because, as you say, you need to hit longitudinal escape velocity. So, you know, when the situation doesn't get any worse, could they plausibly expect that within their lifetime, we might get to the point where natural death, so sort of death not from accidents, is abolished?
I would certainly hope so. And indeed, Dr. Aubrey de Grey of the SENS Research Foundation has revised his time frame to be a bit more optimistic recently. He states that within about 17 years, and with sufficient funding, there's about a 50% probability of reaching longevity escape velocity. That means people in their mid-30s today are going to be in their late 50s or early 60s by the time that that happens. So those interventions would then be just in time to stave off the worst of biological senescence. But as you can see, because there's a bit of uncertainty built into those timeframes, and they're certainly contingent on what happens in the broader society and the extent of public support for these advances, advocacy is crucial. And getting people convinced that this is a worthwhile pursuit is crucial, because whether it happens a decade sooner or a decade later is going to make an enormous difference to the individuals who are alive today.
Well, I've got to say, it's been a real pleasure. It's been really interesting. Thank you very much for your time. I should apologise for my slightly scruffy attire. Very, very unusually for Britain, it's baking hot today. So I'm sweating quite a bit. But no, so thank you very much.